The doorman found him at 4:30 in the morning. Gringotts did not technically have a 4:30 in the morning. It kept its own time, goblin time, measured in volt cycles and shift rotations and the slow pull of deep earth. But the doorman had worked the bronze door for 11 years, and he knew what the pre-dawn dark looked like through its upper transom. The Diagon alley lanterns burning low and amber, the cobblestones empty, the white marble facade of the bank's exterior glowing faintly against a sky that had not yet decided whether to go on being night. He knew what the steps looked like, unoccupied. They did not look that way this morning. The doorman stepped inside without touching anything and went to find Griphook. He found him in the Eastern Records corridor, cross-referencing the night's intake ledger with the sub-vault acquisition manifests. The kind of work Griphook was frequently assigned because he was thorough, because he did not require supervision, and because his colleagues found prolonged proximity to his silence uncomfortable. Griphook looked up from the ledger when the doorman appeared in the doorway, registered the particular quality of the doorman's expression, and closed the ledger without asking any questions. Whatever was on the steps was not a package. The child lay curled on the third marble step down, tucked against the balustrade, as though he had arranged himself there deliberately. He was 3 years old, perhaps 4, small enough that Griphook, crouching beside him, did not block the lantern's reach. The boy lay on his side, with one hand tucked beneath his cheek and his knees drawn up slightly, sleeping with the utter vacancy of the very young. He wore a muggle child's clothing, worn and slightly too large. His hair was black and untidy and pointed in 3 separate directions, and even in the shadow of the step, even in the thin amber light that fell slanted across the white marble from the alley lanterns, there was something on the boy's forehead, a mark, raised and fine, shaped like a crack of lightning. Griphook had seen the Daily Prophet. Every goblin employed at Gringotts' Wizarding Bank had seen the Daily Prophet's coverage of the events of Halloween, 1981, and the weeks that followed. He knew what the scar meant. He had known it the moment the doorman's face told him there was a child on the steps. He looked at the boy for a long time, without moving. The alley was silent and empty. No footsteps retreated around the corner of the bank's white marble facade. No figures lingered at the mouth of Nocturne Alley or by the apothecary further down. There was just the boy, alone on the step, sleeping as though he had always been here and had simply not been noticed until now. Griphook looked up and down the alley once, a careful and complete assessment, and then looked back at the child. He reached out and gently turned the boy's right hand over. He saw the ring before he fully understood what he was seeing. It sat on the 3rd finger, too large by half, held in place by a strip of pale cloth wound twice around the band and knotted at the back, and even by lantern light its metalwork was unmistakable. The band had a particular quality to it, a warmth and exactness in the working of the metal that no human craftsman had ever managed to convincingly replicate. Griphook touched the surface with the pad of his thumb, careful and deliberate, and felt what he had been trained since childhood to recognize, the maker's signature living in the metal itself, a resonance as distinct and unambiguous as a spoken name. Goblin-made. Old work. Patient. Beautiful. Precise. He looked at the sleeping boy, and the ring and the lightning bolt scar, and a great many things that had seemed separate resolved into a single coherent picture. The picture was going to require the emergency council chamber, the full night staff, and considerably more than what remained of this particular pre-dawn. He picked the child up. Harry Potter, if that was who he was, and Griphook was quite certain that it was, did not wake as he was lifted. He stirred, made a small sound low in his chest, and settled against Griphook's shoulder with the trusting and indifferent weight of the deeply asleep. One small fist, the one that wore the ring, found the lapel of Griphook's outer coat and closed around it loosely, without intention, the way very young children grip things in their sleep, as though everything might be taken from them if they let go. Griphook carried him through the bronze outer doors, which the doorman held without being asked, through the small entrance hall with its low stone ceiling and its smell of old metal and cold, deep earth, and the particular mineral stillness of a place that had been continuously occupied for 6 centuries, through the silver inner doors, which bore their engraved warning about theft and duplicity in 4 languages, the warning that most wizards paused to read, and that goblins passed without a glance, having memorized it as children and never needed it since. And then into the vast marble hall. The hall was on its night staffing, a skeleton crew of 11 clerks maintaining their stations at the long curved counter, while the day shift slept in the lower level quarters. They looked up as Griphook crossed the marble floor. One opened his mouth. Griphook shook his head once, a small and decisive movement, and the mouth closed. He found a bench behind the Eastern Service counter and sat on it with the boy in his lap. The child slept on through all of it. The movement, the changing acoustics of stone and height, the particular unfamiliarity of goblin hands, and did not wake until Griphook had been still for perhaps 20 minutes. Then the boy simply opened his eyes. They were green, very bright and very green, the color of new leaves in that particular moment, just after rain when the light is still low, and they moved around the marble hall with a slow and unhurried curiosity before settling on Griphook's face. The boy did not cry. He did not reach for someone else, or pull away, or ask where he was, or where the people who were supposed to be with him had gone. He looked at Griphook with neither fear nor recognition, only a watchfulness that seemed, in something so young, almost considered. He reached out with the hand that wore the ring and touched the lapel of Griphook's coat. Then he closed his eyes again. Griphook sat with him in the amber dark of the marble hall and did not move, and did not yet summon anyone, though he would need to soon. The hall breathed around them in its night rhythms, the scratch of ledger quills at the counter, the quiet roll of a sorting cart returning from the lower levels, the distant and constant hum of the vault corridors running deep beneath their feet. The boy's weight was slight and warm and absolutely still. He thought, whoever had brought this child here, by intention or by whatever strange and broken accident, had ended with a 3-year-old on a bank's front steps in the dark, had aimed, however unknowingly, correctly. Then he signaled to the senior clerk. The bronze outer doors swung shut with a sound like a held breath released, a deep concussive resonance that carried through the floor and up through the bench and into Griphook's bones. A junior clerk posted the notice against the inside of the glass, closed until further notice. 3 others, without being directed, pulled the iron floor latches into their brackets, one by one, with a succession of solid and final sounds. In 30 years of service, Griphook had never seen those doors shut before 9 in the morning. He looked down at the boy asleep in his lap, at the ring on the cloth-wound finger, at the scar, pale and precise in the low amber light. He did not put him down. The room they used for emergency council sessions was 40 feet below the marble hall, and had not been built with comfort in mind. Griphook had been summoned there perhaps a dozen times in his career, always for matters that could not wait for the scheduled rotations, and could not be discussed in earshot of visiting wizards. It was a low-ceilinged chamber, lit by lanterns that burned with a greenish tinge, a function of the minerals in the oil, and it smelled of cold stone and the particular mineral damp of the deep vaults, and of the centuries of deliberation that had settled into the walls like sediment. The senior council of Gringotts sat on stone benches arranged in a rough semicircle around a central examination table. 13 goblins, counting Griphook. In the middle of the examination table, on a square of dark cloth, sat the ring. Harry Potter sat on a bench against the far wall beside Griphook, wrapped in Griphook's outer coat, because the chamber was cold, and the coat was the nearest available thing, eating a piece of bread that someone had procured from the night kitchen. He ate with complete concentration, looking at the bread, and not at the ring, and not at the council, and not at the low green-lit ceiling pressing down above them. He did not seem troubled by the chamber, or the hour, or the 13 goblins who were attempting, collectively, to give the impression that they were not watching him. He was 3 years old. He was eating bread. He had, apparently, decided that both of those facts were sufficient. The examination proceeded in silence. The first of the 3 senior examiners lifted the ring from its cloth, turned it in the green light, and set it back down. He said a single phrase in gobbledygook, flat and declarative, certain as the closing of a vault door. The second examiner did the same phrase. The third, the oldest of the 3, whose name was Ragnok, and who had been examining contested items for Gringotts since before Griphook had been apprenticed, held the ring for longer. He brought it close to the lantern and turned the band slowly, and Griphook watched him locate the maker's mark, the way one locates a word one has been seeking, not by searching, but by allowing the eye to settle where it must. Ragnok set the ring down and said the phrase, and then added 4 more words that Griphook translated privately to himself. Old work. Pre-statute. The ring was goblin-made. The maker's mark on the inner band was legible under the engraving a wizard's hand had added later. A human modification overlaid on goblin craft as old as anything Griphook had seen in 4 decades of vault work. The law on this point had never been ambiguous and did not require interpretation now. Goblin-made objects belonged to their goblin makers in perpetuity. Those who purchased them held them on sufferance. They rented, they never owned, and upon the buyer's death, those objects reverted. This was not a principle. It was simply the shape of things. The council clerk, a young goblin named Fergold, who had ink on 3 separate fingers and the slightly frantic energy of someone who has been awake since midnight, brought the account records and spread them on the examination table beside the ring. The council looked at them and said nothing, and the silence had a particular quality. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but of people with a great deal to say, who are deciding in what order to say it. The ring's maker's mark corresponded to an order placed through Gringotts approximately 31 years prior. The purchasing account was Vault 687, registered in the name of the Potter family. The succession documents attached to the vault, last updated in the autumn of 1981, in the weeks before it had gone dormant, named a single heir, Harry James Potter, born the 31st of July, 1980. Fergold looked at the child on the bench beside Griphook, then at the ring on the examination table, then at the council. He did not say anything. The room was very quiet. Then the debate began. It was civil, as Gringotts' debates always were. Goblins had long since learned that those who shouted first won nothing, but it was not gentle. A senior councillor named Brack argued for immediate surrender. The child was the boy who had survived the dark wizard's curse, and the wizarding world would tear itself apart looking for him. Holding him created exposure, not leverage. File the ring claim with the ICW separately, return the child to the ministry, and use the legal process to negotiate from a position of good faith. The counter-argument came from 2 directions at once. The older councillor said what they always said, that goblin good faith had been extended and extended, and the result had always been the same. The ministry would take the child, note the ring claim, defer the matter, and the deferment would outlast the memory of it. The newer councillors arrived at the same position by a different route. The child was extraordinary, not because of the ring alone, but because of what the scar on his forehead meant to a wizarding world that had spent 2 years celebrating what it believed the scar stood for. The people beyond those bronze doors would do a great deal for this child. The question was what Gringotts wished them to do. Griphook waited until the room had finished. Then he said briefly what he had been thinking since the marble steps. Whoever had removed this child from whatever protection was supposed to contain him had brought him here. Not to the ministry, not to a wizarding family's door, not to a healer or an aura station or any of the other places a 3-year-old in distress might reasonably have appeared. To the front steps of Gringotts' Wizarding Bank in the deep dark before dawn, with a goblin-made ring on his finger. Griphook did not believe that events arranged themselves into this kind of precision by accident. Gringotts would not act as though that meant nothing. The council deliberated for another hour. At the end of it, the resolution was this. The child would remain in Gringotts' temporary custody, in conditions suitable for a wizarding child of his age. A formal notification, not a surrender, not an invitation, would be sent to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, advising that Gringotts had taken temporary custody of an unaccompanied wizarding child found on its premises and was awaiting legal clarification of his status. The ring claim would be filed separately with the International Confederation of Wizards through proper channels. The chamber emptied. The ring went to Ragnarok. Griphook was given the child. He had not asked to be given the child. No one else had offered. Later, much later, when the chamber was empty and the senior council had retired and the bank had reached whatever version of quiet it could manage with a 3-year-old sleeping in its eastern storeroom, Griphook sat on the stone floor with his back against the wall and watched. Harry Potter slept on a pallet of folded clerk's robes. He slept the way he seemed to do everything, with complete and unself-conscious commitment. The ring had been placed in a small wooden box sitting on the floor beside the pallet, closed and latched. In his sleep, Harry's right hand had found the box. It lay on top of it, palm flat, fingers loosely spread, the way a child holds something it does not want anyone to take while it is not watching. Griphook watched this for a long time and said nothing. He had been a vault escort for 30 years. He had accompanied wizards into chambers that held more gold than most countries would see in a century. He had carried objects of extraordinary age and power through tunnels that went deeper than any surface map acknowledged. He had guarded things worth more than the people who owned them could imagine. He had never guarded anything that reached for what was its. Outside, somewhere above them, Diagon Alley was beginning to find the pale light of early morning. The great bronze doors of the bank were shut against it. The sign was still posted. Griphook sat on the floor and kept watch, and the child slept on. The Gringotts notification arrived at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement at 7:43 in the morning, addressed in the unornamental hand of goblin bureaucracy to the head of the office. It had been routed first through the improper use of magic office. An unaccompanied wizarding child was, technically, a matter for their records, and the witch who opened the envelope there had read the first line and resealed it immediately and sent it upward, marked urgent in red ink that was still damp when it reached the desk of Bartemius Crouch. He read it twice. He put it flat on his desk with both hands, as though he wanted to make sure it stayed there. Then he reached for parchment. By mid-morning, the story had broken completely, which was to say it had broken the way that stories about Harry Potter broke, all at once, without warning, and with no mechanism for containing it afterward. every owl in Wizarding Britain seemed to be carrying a copy of the Daily Prophet simultaneously. The front page was a single broadsheet of bold black letters above a photograph of Gringotts' white marble facade. Its great bronze doors conspicuously shut against the length of Diagon Alley, 2 goblins visible in the doorway, and visibly not moving. Boy who lived found at Gringotts. The headline read, "Harry Potter, sole survivor of you-know-who's attack, discovered on bank steps, aged 3. Below it, in only slightly smaller type, "Goblins refuse ministry access. The wizarding world, which had spent 2 years celebrating a victory and telling itself the famous child was somewhere safe, erupted." Lucius Malfoy read the prophet over breakfast. He had been awake since 6, which was his habit regardless of what the household was doing, and he was on his 2nd cup of coffee when his owl brought the paper and dropped it on the table beside his plate. He was 29 years old, perhaps 30, depending on the month. The exact date had always been recorded with the approximate care of families who considered their arrival self-evidently significant. And he had a pale, pointed face and ice-cold grey eyes and long platinum blonde hair. And he read the prophet the way he read everything, without visible reaction, cover to cover, looking not for news, but for implication. He set the paper down. He took a slow sip of coffee. He looked out the tall east-facing windows of Malfoy Manor's breakfast room at the grounds, which were impeccable and still. He had claimed, under oath, to have acted under the imperious curse. No one had been able to prove otherwise. He was free. He had contacts within the ministry at 3 separate levels of seniority, and he understood precisely what the boy who survived Voldemort's curse was worth to anyone who could influence his future. He sent 3 owl letters before the coffee was cold. Narcissa had been standing behind him since the 2nd paragraph. She had come down for breakfast and seen the paper on the table and stopped before she reached her chair, reading over Lucius's shoulder with her hand resting on the back of his seat. She did not sit down. She read the headline, and then the first column, and then looked up from the paper. Through the open breakfast room doorway she could see the corridor, and at the far end of the corridor, the door to the nursery stairs. Draco was 3 years old. He was upstairs, still asleep. He slept late, a habit she had given up attempting to correct, and this morning she was glad of it. Harry Potter, discovered on bank steps, aged 3. She did not say anything. After a moment, she turned and went upstairs. The owl found Dumbledore in his study at Hogwarts at 8:30 in the morning, where he had been since before dawn, working through a stack of correspondence that had accumulated while he managed a staffing difficulty the week prior. He heard the tap at the window and crossed the room to open it, and the owl deposited the prophet and departed again without waiting to be tipped, which was unusual. He unrolled the paper and read the headline and sat down very slowly. He had placed Harry on the doorstep of number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey himself. On the night of the 1st of November 1981, in the quiet that followed a war's ending, he had set the child down while he was sleeping and tucked a letter under the blanket and walked back across the dark garden and away, with the deliberate calm of a man who has built something precisely and need not verify his work. Lily's sacrifice would anchor to Petunia's blood. The enchantment would hold. Harry would be safe. He looked at the paper. Discovered on bank steps, aged 3. He turned the problem over with the care that had served him for over a century, and it would not resolve. He had put Harry on a doorstep in Surrey. Gringotts was in London. These were not reconcilable, and he could not yet see why, because there was nothing in what he knew that explained the distance between them. He did not yet know, because there was no way he could know. that the protection he had walked away so confidently from had never taken hold. He folded the newspaper. He left the correspondence where it was. He left for London within the hour. Remus Lupin read The Prophet in a rented room in northern England. He rented from a widow named Mrs. Caulfield, who lived on the ground floor of a narrow terraced house and charged half a month's rent in advance, and asked no questions about what her lodgers did or where they went, which were the only two requirements Remus currently had for accommodation. He was 23 years old, and had been both 23 and unemployed for almost exactly 2 years, since October 1981, which was since the month everything ended. He had prematurely grey-streaked brown hair and a face worn 10 years older than it was, and he moved between rented rooms when the money ran out and found the next one. Mrs. Caulfield received the Daily Prophet and left it in the hall for the lodgers each morning. Remus had been reading it for 2 months. He picked it up on his way down to find breakfast, and unfolded it on the landing, and read the first line, and then he did not move for quite some time. James was dead. He had known this for 2 years. It did not get smaller. Sirius was in Azkaban for killing James. He still could not hold both of those facts in his mind at the same time without a lurching sensation, as though the floor were briefly somewhere else. He had told himself that staying away was strategy, that he was a werewolf, unemployed, the last standing member of a group of 4 of whom 2 were dead and 1 imprisoned, and that invisibility was the only sensible response to that arithmetic. Peter was dead. That one he could not grieve cleanly, because grief required a shape, and Peter's had none he could hold without the other facts pressing through the edges. Harry was alive. He had known this as well, in the way you know things you cannot verify, by choosing to believe it, because the alternative was not survivable. Alive and safe somewhere, in someone's care. He had told himself this was sufficient. He had told himself many things over 2 years. Alive and alone, on the steps of Gringotts Bank at age 3, was not the same as alive and safe somewhere. He had been letting himself believe the latter for 2 years, because it required nothing of him, because it was a version of the world in which his staying invisible and staying away was the responsible choice rather than the only one he was capable of making. He did not think he had been wrong, exactly. He thought he had simply been in the position of a person constructing a bridge from one side of a river, without any means of checking whether the other side was where he believed it to be. Harry was not where Remus had believed him to be. Harry was in Gringotts. He went back to his room. He packed his single bag, which took 4 minutes because he did not have much. He was down the stairs and out the front door before Mrs. Caulfield came up from the ground floor to collect her newspaper, and he did not leave a note, because he did not know yet where he was going, only that he was going. He came alone, which surprised no one who knew him. Dumbledore arrived at Gringotts on the afternoon of the day the Prophet ran its story, when the crowd of witches and wizards that had gathered along Diagon Alley to look at the closed bronze doors was thick enough that he had to make his way through it slowly, which he did without impatience, inclining his head at the people who recognized him and pressed back to make room. He was very tall and very thin, and his silver hair and beard were long enough that they moved when he walked, and he wore half-moon spectacles and robes of deep blue, and the wand he carried was slender and pale and unremarkable to most eyes. He had been 102 years old since the summer. He did not look it exactly, though he looked something. Old in the way that very old trees look old, which is to say substantial rather than diminished. The scarlet and gold goblin at the bronze doors watched him come up the white marble steps without expression. Dumbledore came to a stop on the top step. He said his name. He said his purpose. He said both things in the same measured, unhurried tone he used for most things, which was not the tone of a man who expected to be denied, but of a man who understood that tone alone didn't constitute an argument. After a brief exchange, the doors opened far enough to admit him. He was shown to the entrance hall. The entrance hall was a cold and stone-floored space between the bronze outer doors and the silver inner doors, low-ceilinged and lit by wall-mounted lanterns that cast more shadow than light. 4 senior goblins met him there, arranged across the width of the hall with the patient, deliberate stillness of people who have considered the geometry of a room before entering it. They did not bow. Dumbledore had not expected them to. He stated his position without preamble, because there was no preamble that would have improved it. He was the magical guardian of Harry James Potter, placed in that role by the Potter's own wishes, and the child needed to be returned to the protective arrangement Dumbledore had established for him. The senior goblin, small, dark-eyed, with the particular economy of expression that the longest-serving Gringotts staff developed, said nothing immediately. Waiting. Dumbledore understood this to be an invitation to continue, and he did. He explained the enchantment carefully, as he would have explained it to a colleague of equal intelligence, rather than to someone he was attempting to persuade. The mechanics were the argument, and the mechanics were sound. When Lily Potter had chosen to stand between her son and death, and had been killed for that choice, she had called into being a protection older than any spell in the standard compendium, a magic of sacrifice and love, woven into Harry's blood and anchored to the blood of Lily's surviving family. Her sister, Petunia Dursley, of number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. While Harry lived there, while he called that house home, the protection would hold against whatever remained of the power that had tried and failed to kill him. There was no safer place in Britain for the child. Dumbledore had put him there himself. The senior goblin let the silence settle for a moment after he finished. Then he replied, and his reply was, as Dumbledore had already half known it would be, perfectly precise. The enchantment Dumbledore described required Harry Potter to live with Petunia Dursley. To live there, not to have been deposited there, not to have been intended to live there, but to have actually resided, long enough and consistently enough that the house became home in the specific way the magic required. Harry Potter had been found on the steps of Gringotts Wizarding Bank in Diagon Alley, London. He had not been living at number 4, Privet Drive. He was not in the protection. Whatever the enchantment's theoretical mechanics, it was not, at present, operative. Dumbledore said nothing for a moment. The silver inner doors opened, and Griphook came through them with the child in his arms. Dumbledore had not asked to see Harry. He had not known he was going to ask until he heard himself do it, quietly, and with no particular force, and the senior goblin had considered him for a moment, and then nodded to Griphook. He did not know what had moved the goblin to agree. He suspected, afterward, that it had been curiosity, the particular curiosity of a very old and experienced creature who wishes to see what a famous wizard looks like when he encounters the limit of himself. Griphook carried Harry into the entrance hall and stopped a few feet away. Harry was awake. He was watching Dumbledore with the same still, assessing attention he appeared to direct at everything. Not fearful, not curious in the way a child distracted by a bright object is curious, but careful, taking account. Dumbledore folded himself down to one knee on the cold flagstone, so that he was at the level of those eyes. They were green. He had known they would be. He had been told. He had expected. He had prepared himself. They were still Lily's eyes, completely, entirely, with no modification. The same exact shade, and the same almond shape, and the same quality of attention, looking at him from below a lightning bolt scar, and above a small, serious face that he did not recognize at all. "Harry," he said. The child looked at him. He did not say Dumbledore's name because he did not know it. He did not know any of the things that name meant. The weight of it, the century behind it, the specific and enormous significance of the title of Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, or Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, or what it had meant in 1945 to defeat a man named Grindelwald and end a war that had been consuming Europe for a decade. He looked at Dumbledore the way he had looked at the goblins, and the marble hall and the stone ceiling, and everything else he had apparently encountered since arriving on these steps. As a piece of information, he was still in the process of evaluating. He did not reach out. He did not speak. Dumbledore's expression, for one moment, one single unguarded moment in a face that had spent over a century learning to be composed, was the expression of a man who had constructed a plan on a foundation he had been certain was stone, and has just discovered that the foundation was not there. He rose. He asked, because there was nothing else to be done, about the ring. The senior goblin's reply was brief and final. The ring was goblin-made, and under goblin law it had reverted to Gringotts' custody on the 31st of October, 1981, upon the death of its owner. James Potter had died on that date. The ring was no longer a matter for wizarding negotiation. Dumbledore looked at the ring, which was not visible. It was in the goblin's keeping, somewhere beyond the silver doors, for a moment that held in it all of the things he did not say, which were considerable. He was the most powerful wizard alive. The wand he carried had not been bested in combat in 38 years. He could feel, in the precise and experienced way of someone who has been in a very large number of difficult rooms, the weight of the force he might choose to deploy, and the absolute certainty of what deploying it here would cost him. He would lose Harry. He would lose every avenue of legitimate recovery. He would hand every other party in this dispute a weapon that could not be countered. He said he would return with documentation. He said it pleasantly. He put on his hat and turned toward the bronze doors. Behind him, on the inner side of the silver doors, Griphook was watching. He had watched the entire exchange from that position, close enough to observe, far enough not to be part of it, and he had noted a series of things with the methodical attention that was his professional habit. The old wizard had not raised his voice. He had not invoked his wand or even touched it. When his argument failed, he had not repeated it more forcefully or looked for an angle that might circumvent the answer he had been given. He had asked to see the child as a personal request, not a legal claim, and when denied the ring, he had accepted the refusal as a procedural fact rather than a provocation. Griphook filed all of this away. A man who operated within the law, even when the law was not running in his favor, was a man who could be negotiated with. That would matter. He did not yet know how much. He looked down at Harry, who was still in his arms, and was watching the old wizard's retreating back through the entrance hall with the same level, unreadable attention he had directed at his face. "He will come back," Griphook said. Harry looked at him. He said nothing. That, Griphook thought, was probably accurate too. 3 days after the discovery, Lucius Malfoy came to Gringotts. He came at 10 in the morning, when Diagon Alley's crowds were already thick enough that a goblin watching from the doorway would have seen how easily they parted for him. He brought a barrister, a tall, angular witch with a document case of very good leather, and the composed expression of someone paid to be both visible and unobtrusive, and a formal petition bound in dark green vellum and sealed with the Malfoy crest in silver wax. He was 29 years old, perhaps 30, with a pale and pointed face and ice-cold grey eyes and long platinum blonde hair, and he was shown to the entrance hall. The entrance hall was cold and stone-floored, and smelled of metal and old earth, and the 2 goblins who received him there did not offer him a seat. Lucius handed the petition across the counter with the minimal ceremony of a man who has prepared careful documents and knows it, and stood while it was read with his expression arranged in the mild, cooperative attentiveness of someone entirely at ease. The petition invoked an ancient custodial tradition, one that predated the ministry's current legal framework, as he noted for the record, by several centuries. When the male heir of a pure-blood house was orphaned and without a legal guardian in active residence, a house of equivalent standing could petition for wardship. The Potters were an ancient wizarding family of considerable magical heritage. The Malfoys were among those families whose blood had been recognized as genuinely pure since the age of the Pure Blood Directory. He wished the Council to understand, not asserting ownership of a child. He was offering Harry Potter a home. The Goblin clerk read through the final page, set it flat on the counter, and said the petition had been received and would be reviewed. He made no commitment as to timeline. Lucius thanked him. He was shown back to the bronze doors. He was not the kind of man who showed frustration in public. He was not the kind of man, for that matter, who felt frustration in the ordinary sense. He felt inconvenience, tactical setback, the specific and calibrated irritation of something proceeding more slowly than planned. He descended the white marble steps onto the Diagon Alley cobbles, and adjusted the fall of his robes, and said nothing to his barrister, who had the sense to say nothing to him. Narcissa had been standing in the entrance hall while he spoke. She had positioned herself slightly apart from Lucius and his barrister, near the wall by the lantern bracket, because she understood which conversations required her presence, and which required her presence to be peripheral, and this was the second kind. The silver inner doors had opened briefly during the exchange, a junior goblin passing through on some other errand, and in the gap, for perhaps 3 seconds, she had seen the marble hall beyond. She knew the hall's dimensions. She had been inside Gringotts many times. What she had not known was that there was a small boy sitting on the far counter on what appeared to be a folded coat, eating something, bread or a bit of something, with the concentrated attention of a child entirely absorbed in the immediate task. Black hair, very small. He was not looking at the doors. He was looking at his bread. She had her own 3-year-old at home. Draco ate breakfast the same way, fork in his fist, complete exclusive attention, as though it were a serious project. He had Lucius's eyes and her own tendency toward deliberate focus, and sometimes when she watched him eat, she thought about how strange it was that a child could already be recognizably a particular person at 3, already himself, already someone you could describe to a stranger and have them understand who you meant. The silver doors closed. Narcissa turned away from the wall and followed Lucius toward the bronze doors. Her expression had not changed. That, too, was something she had learned over years. By the end of the week, the petitions on the senior clerk's counter had become a stack. Griphook watched them accumulate with the attentiveness he applied to all documentation, not reading each one, that was not his role, but noting their patterns, volume, frequency, the weight of the seals. The ministry's petition had arrived on the 4th day, formally worded and countersigned at 2 levels of seniority, requesting Harry be placed in ministry protective custody, pending legal determination of his status. It was exactly the kind of document the ministry produced when it wished to move with authority and had not quite decided on the direction. The Longbottom family's legal representative had sent a separate petition the following morning, a different register entirely, more careful and more tentative, citing the family's historical standing as an ancient, pure blood house, and requesting not custody, but formal notification of any proceedings affecting Harry Potter's status, and a voice at any subsequent table. It was the most intelligent document of the three, precisely because it did not overreach. The Dumbledore correspondence had arrived separately, through official ministry channels, and concerned itself entirely with the question of the blood protection, and was, as the senior counsel had already noted, addressing a point that was not currently in dispute. Griphook stood at the marble hall counter in the mid-morning and looked at the tidy stack of sealed parchment, and he thought, "Every one of these wizards wants the boy, and not one of them came to find him." They had each come because of what Harry Potter represented: a legal position, a political claim, a demonstration of standing and interest. They had composed careful documents and sent them by owl and waited for replies. None of them had been on marble steps in the dark at 4:30 in the morning, looking at a 3-year-old child and a goblin-made ring and deciding that this was a thing that required action. He went back to the room where Harry was staying. Harry had climbed down from his pallet at some point during the morning and was sitting on the stone floor beside the small wooden box that held the ring, with both hands flat on the lid. The box had been moved to the vault-keeper's office earlier that day, or had been intended to be. Clearly something in that chain of custody had gone awry, because here was the box and here was Harry, sitting next to it with the settled patience of someone who has been waiting for a task to become uninterrupted and has now achieved it. He was not trying to open the box. He was simply sitting next to it with his hands on the lid, in the particular way of a child who does not need to open something to know what is inside. A junior goblin came in to collect it. Harry looked at the junior goblin with the same level, unhurried attention he directed at everything new. Then he put his hands more firmly on the lid. The junior goblin looked at Griphook. "Mine," Harry said. It was very clear. No upward inflection, no request for confirmation, no uncertainty about whether the word applied. A statement directed at the universe from someone who had considered the matter and reached a conclusion. The junior goblin continued to look at Griphook. Griphook made a very small movement of his head, almost imperceptible, but not ambiguous. The junior goblin went away without the box. Griphook sat down on the floor beside Harry and the box. He did not say anything about ownership or goblin law or the legal circumstances under which objects reverted upon a buyer's death. He sat on the stone floor with his back against the wall, and Harry, after a moment, leaned sideways until he was resting against Griphook's arm, not reaching, not asking, simply adjusting his position to include the nearest available solid thing. The box stayed where it was. Harry's hands stayed on the lid. Outside, in the marble hall, another owl arrived with another sealed petition. Griphook heard it distantly, the brief exchange at the clerk's counter, the scratch of a quill in the intake ledger, the soft sound of a document joining others in a stack. He did not go out to look at it. He had rehearsed it on the way down from the north. He had rehearsed it on 3 different trains and a night bus connection, and the last stretch on foot from the leaky cauldron through the pub's back courtyard and down Diagon Alley, composing and discarding sentences the whole way. Something credible, something that sounded like a reason and not like desperation, though it was both, and he had stopped being able to tell them apart 2 years ago. He was not an aura. He had no legal standing. He was 23 years old and wore his best robes, which had been his best robes for 4 years and showed it, and he had exactly one thing to say to whoever answered the bronze door of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, and he said it. He said that he was here because he was James Potter's closest friend, and Harry Potter deserved someone who loved his father. The doorman goblin looked at him with the flat, patient expression of someone who has heard a great many things at this door over the past 5 days, and has received clear instructions about all of them. He said that Gringotts was not admitting visitors at this time. He said this in a tone that communicated, with considerable precision, that the category of visitors encompassed any wizarding person without a specific legal claim, ministry credential, or formal petition, and that Remus Lupin clearly did not have any of those things. He closed the door. Remus stood on the top step and looked at the bronze doors for a moment. He had known it was likely. He had known it before he left Mrs. Caulfield's house, before he packed his bag, before he got on the train. It did not make the closed door feel smaller. He sat down on the marble step and put his elbows on his knees and thought about what to do next, which took longer than it should have, because what to do next required knowing where to go, and the only place he currently knew Harry was behind that door. He sat there for perhaps 20 minutes. Then the door opened again, and it was not the doorman. Griphook had been crossing the entrance hall with the morning's intake ledger when the doorman's message reached him. A note passed to a junior clerk and relayed up the chain with the particular brevity that goblin internal communication had refined over centuries. An unauthorized visitor refused admission. Name: Remus Lupin. He had not meant to stop. He had stopped. The name connected to something he had read that morning in the Vault succession files for Vault 687. James Potter's documentation, updated in the weeks before his death, had included the standard witnesses, 2 solicitors, a ministry representative, and below those, in the section for named associates, 3 names: Sirius Black, Peter Pettigrew, Remus Lupin. Not heirs, not guardians, witnesses. Names James Potter had chosen to include. Griphook went to the door and opened it himself. The wizard sitting on the marble step was thin in the way that people who eat irregularly and sleep poorly become thin. Not dramatically, not visibly ill, but worn, like something that has been used past its natural period without care. He had brown hair, shot through with premature grey, and a face that looked 10 years older than it was, and he looked up at Griphook with the expression of someone who has been expecting to wait a long time and is not certain yet whether this is a reprieve or a further complication. Griphook said, "You knew James Potter." "Yes," Remus said. "Come inside." The marble hall was mid-morning, busy in the particular way of a bank that has not fully reopened to the public. Clerks moving between stations, vault escorts in the lower corridors, a steady bureaucratic industry behind the closed bronze doors. Remus stood inside the silver inner doors and looked at it, and then looked across the hall to the long, curved counter on the far side, and he went very still. Harry was sitting on the counter on a folded coat, watching a goblin sort through a tray of coins with the focused attention he apparently directed at anything that involved small objects and deliberate movement. He was not looking at the door. His hair was black and stuck up in at least 4 separate directions, and his legs dangled off the edge of the counter, and from across the hall, Remus could see the scar on his forehead, pale and precise, shaped like a crack of lightning. He had James's hair. He had Lily's eyes, green, very bright, the colour Remus had always thought of as the specific shade that Lily's eyes were, and nothing else. He had James's hair, and Lily's eyes, and he existed. And for 2 years Remus had been telling himself it was sufficient to know the child was safe somewhere without being able to see it. And now he could see it, and it turned out that these were not the same thing at all. He sat down on the floor of the marble hall without really deciding to. One moment he was standing, and then he was on the cold marble with his back against one of the great columns, and his hands were not quite steady, and he did not trust himself to stand up again immediately. Harry noticed. He looked over from his coin-sorting goblin with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything, and he considered Remus for a moment, and then he climbed down from the counter. This took some time. He was 3 years old and the counter was high, and he approached the descent with the methodical caution of someone who has learned that heights require negotiation. He got down. He walked across the marble hall in the unhurried way of a child who knows the floor is solid and has nowhere particular to be, and he stood in front of Remus and stared at him. Remus looked up at him. Harry sat down on the floor too. They sat there on the cold marble and looked at each other in the way of people who have just been introduced to something very large and are not yet sure how to speak around it. Remus thought about James, which he always did. He thought about Lily. He thought about the last 2 years spent in rented rooms, moving whenever the money ran out, and telling himself that this, the invisible, the absent, the careful management of surviving, was the responsible arithmetic for a werewolf with nothing to offer anyone. Griphook crouched beside him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you know about the ring?" It was, Remus realized, an interview. He answered it honestly, which was the only thing he knew how to do, and which had been, at various points in his life, both his best quality and his worst. The Potters, he explained, were descended from Ignotus Peveril, the youngest of the 3 brothers, the one who had greeted death as a friend and walked away from him, from whom the cloak of invisibility had come down through the family line over centuries. James had the cloak. A signet ring was consistent with that inheritance, a piece of family history that meant something because of what it marked, not what it was worth. Griphook listened. He said, "Who else remains alive who knew James Potter well enough to tell me about his history?" Remus was quiet for a moment. "3 of us," he said. "We called ourselves the Marauders. There was Sirius Black." He paused. "He's in Azkaban. He was arrested the day after. The Ministry believed he had betrayed James and Lily to Voldemort. He did not say whether he had believed it too, and Griphook did not ask. There was Peter Pettigrew. He died the same day, the same arrest, the street explosion." He stopped again. "And there was me." He did not say the third thing. He didn't need to. Goblins, in his experience, were excellent judges of what wizards left out of sentences. Griphook looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, with the particular economy of someone who has made a decision and sees no reason to ornament it, "Remus could remain within Gringotts as an informal presence, not as a claimant, not as a legal party of any kind, as a witness to Harry's welfare, and in exchange, he would answer Griphook's questions about James Potter's history and the ring's significance as best he could." Remus said yes before Griphook had quite finished speaking. He had nowhere else to be. He had nothing else. And Harry was here, sitting on the marble floor beside him, leaning slightly sideways against his arm with the unself-conscious trust of a child who hasn't yet learned that trust is supposed to be earned before it is given. Within the hour, Harry was asleep on his knee. Remus sat very still and watched the marble hall's mid-morning business continue around them, the goblins moving between stations, the ledger quills scratching at the counter, and he kept his hand curved loosely around Harry's back, not quite holding, the way you hold something you are afraid to grip too tightly in case it turns out not to be real. Griphook sat on a bench a few feet away and watched this and said nothing. 2 weeks after the discovery, the entrance hall of Gringotts Wizarding Bank was arranged for a tribunal. The goblins had placed a long table of dark wood across the width of the hall, behind which 5 members of the senior council sat with the particular composure of people who have spent centuries not being impressed by wizards. Facing them, across a stretch of cold stone floor, were 4 chairs. The lanterns burned at their usual low gold. The bronze outer doors were shut. The silver inner doors, those that led to the marble hall and everything beyond it, were also shut, latched from the inside, with a junior goblin standing at attention before them. The hall had never been precisely warm, but with the door sealed, it had something close to the quality of a vault, contained, quiet, removed from the world above. They were admitted in sequence, as though the goblins had considered the political geometry of entrance order and arranged it deliberately. The ministry representative came first, a senior official from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, carrying a leather portfolio. Then Dumbledore, alone, silver-haired and unhurried, wearing deep blue robes and carrying his pale wand at his side. Then Lucius Malfoy with his barrister, both of them impeccably dressed, moving through the low doorway with the ease of people who have never needed to make themselves smaller for a room. Then last, admitted by Griphook from a door Remus had not seen used before, Remus himself, thin, grey-flecked, wearing robes that had been pressed as recently as this morning, and which were already creasing. He took the chair at the far end of the row and sat with his hands in his lap and waited. Dumbledore was given the floor first, which seemed to have been agreed upon in advance. He did not stand. He spoke from his chair, with the unhurried clarity of a man who has given a great many speeches in a great many difficult rooms, and has learned that authority does not require volume. He did not repeat the blood protection argument. He had understood, when that argument failed the first time in this hall, that repeating it with greater force was not a strategy. What he said instead was this: the question of Harry Potter's guardianship was not simply a question of who was best equipped to care for the child. It was a question of what guardianship would mean in the world as it currently existed. Voldemort was gone. He was not dead, but he was diminished, scattered, reduced for the time being to something that was not yet a threat. The threat was not the Dark Lord. The threat was what remained of his followers, those who had served him, who had not been imprisoned, who were at this moment living quietly in Wizarding Britain under whatever cover they had constructed for themselves, waiting to see what would happen next. Any public guardianship arrangement, any settlement that appeared in ministry records and established Harry Potter's circumstances and location, was a roadmap for whatever remained of his followers, and roadmaps waited patiently to be used. He looked at the Goblin Council as he said this, and not at Lucius Malfoy. Lucius let a small silence pass when Dumbledore finished. He had the practiced courtesy of someone who treats the act of waiting as a form of deference, which it was not. The child, he said, was already public. The Daily Prophet had run the story on the morning after his discovery. Every witch and wizard in Britain knew Harry Potter was at Gringotts. The secrecy Dumbledore described, the careful invisibility, the arrangement behind closed doors, no longer existed as a possibility. The question was not whether Harry Potter's situation was known. It was known. The question was whether a known child would be raised in appropriate circumstances or would spend his minority in a bank, being cared for by goblins who had no legal obligation to him and no particular preparation for wizarding childhood. He said this pleasantly. He said it without looking at Remus Lupin. The goblin spokesperson spoke next, and briefly. Gringotts' position had not changed, and would not change. The ring was goblin-made, and under goblin law it had reverted to Gringotts' custody on the 31st of October, 1981. That matter was not before this tribunal, and was not available for negotiation. The child's custody was a separate question, and a wizarding one. Gringotts had no claim on the child and did not seek one. Gringotts was prepared to cooperate with whatever arrangement was legally reached, provided the ring was not included in any settlement. The ministry representative began to speak, something about protective custody and the ministry's statutory responsibility for unaccompanied wizarding minors, and Remus raised his hand. He had not planned it for this precise moment. The ministry representative had begun to outline a framework for temporary custody, and the moment arrived whether or not he was ready for it, and he raised his hand. The ministry representative stopped. He looked at Remus. He looked at the goblin chair. The goblin chair, the senior council member at the center of the table, looked, almost imperceptibly, sideways. At Griphook, who stood along the far wall. Griphook made a very small movement of his head. The goblin chair looked at Remus and said, "You may speak." Remus said there was a will. The hall was not very large, and it was very quiet, so everyone heard him clearly. He said, "James and Lily Potter made a will. He knew because he had been one of the witnesses. The will named Harry's legal guardian. He paused because there was a part of him, a specific, stubborn, grief-soaked part that had been carrying this for 2 years without anyone to put it down in front of, that needed a moment. He said, "The guardian named in the will is Sirius Black." The room went still in the particular way of a space in which several people are exercising a great deal of simultaneous effort not to react. Dumbledore looked at the table and did not look at anything else for a moment. The ministry representative looked at his portfolio. Remus looked at Lucius Malfoy. Lucius Malfoy's jaw did not move. His expression did not change, but his eyes moved. A single, controlled, almost imperceptible shift, to Remus, then away, that contained, Remus thought, a very specific kind of recalculation. The ministry representative cleared his throat. He said, with the careful precision of someone reading from a brief he has memorized for this exact contingency, Sirius Black was currently serving a life sentence in Azkaban prison, convicted of the murder of 12 Muggles and 1 Peter Pettigrew, and of his role in the events that led to the deaths of James and Lily Potter. A man serving a life sentence could not legally act as guardian to a minor. Remus said, "He has not been given a trial." The ministry representative opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his portfolio. He said, and there was, in his voice, the specific quality of a man who has just recognized that something in his briefing didn't account for this, that the matter of Sirius Black's trial was a separate legal question from the question of the will's validity. Remus said that he agreed entirely. Both questions needed to be resolved, and until they were, he assumed the tribunal would agree that no permanent guardianship arrangement could be granted to any other party, since the will's named guardian had not been formally disqualified through proper legal process. The silence that followed this was longer. The ministry representative looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at his hands with the expression of a man who has just watched something happen that he did not expect and which, he is privately acknowledging to himself, is going to complicate the next several months considerably. The Goblin Chair said that the tribunal would be adjourned, pending assessment of the will's validity and formal review of the named guardian's legal status. In the interim, the child's custody arrangements would remain as presently constituted. Lucius Malfoy rose. He buttoned his robes with a single precise gesture and crossed the hall to the bronze doors without speaking to anyone, not to Dumbledore, not to his barrister, not to the ministry representative, and went through them and out into Diagon Alley. Dumbledore watched him go. He watched the bronze doors for a moment, after they closed, with the particular attention of someone tracking the trajectory of a thing that has just changed direction. Remus let out a long, slow breath through his nose. Griphook, still standing along the far wall, observed this without comment. In the adjacent room, on the other side of the latched silver doors, Harry Potter was sitting on Griphook's folded coat on the counter, watching a goblin demonstrate something with a set of small weights and a brass scale, and was entirely unaware of what had just been decided, and undecided in his name. 3 weeks after the discovery, Remus Lupin realized he had lost track of the moon. It was not a mistake he had made since the age of 9, when the condition had become the central navigational fact of his life. The moon's phase was always present in his awareness, a number counting down in the back of his mind whether he wanted it there or not. 3 days. 4 days. The arithmetic of how much time remained before the thing he carried in him stopped being something he could contain. He had not lost the count in 14 years. He had been too distracted. He had been spending his days in the marble hall, watching Harry learn the goblin word for bronze, and forget it, and learn it again. And he had simply not been attending to the number. And now it was 4 days, and he was living inside the most heavily secured building in Wizarding Britain, with a staff of several hundred goblins, and 1 3-year-old child, and he could not transform here. He found Griphook that evening, and told him. He kept it brief, because the facts were brief. He was a werewolf. The full moon was in 4 days. He needed to be elsewhere for the 3 nights of it. He delivered this with the practiced flatness of someone who has given the disclosure many times and leads with the logistical rather than the personal, because the logistical was what people actually needed, and the personal was where the pity usually lived. Griphook listened without expression. He made a note. He said he would arrange something. He did not ask how Remus had come to be a werewolf. He did not say he was sorry. In 14 years of managing people's responses to this disclosure, Griphook's was the best Remus had ever received. The following morning, Griphook told him without preamble that arrangements had been made. A secured location outside the bank, known to the goblins through channels that had nothing to do with the Ministry of Magic, where Remus could spend the 3 nights of the moon. He said the location was not comfortable. He said it was adequate. He gave Remus the address written on a folded piece of paper in the close, angular script of goblin handwriting, and Remus took it without comment. Remus was not accustomed to being helped without being pitied first. He said thank you. Griphook looked at him for a moment, the particular look of someone who has noted an unexpected effect and filed it away for later examination, and went back to the ledger. The first morning of the moon, Remus left before Harry woke. For the first 3 hours Harry asked for him. He used the name he had chosen for Remus, which was not Remus. Harry's naming system was direct and immediate, and his quality for Remus was that he was sad. He came to Griphook 3 separate times and said, with complete patience, "Where is the sad one?" Each time, Griphook said, "He will return." After the 3rd hour, Harry accepted this and returned to his primary occupation, watching the goblins work from his position on Griphook's coat on the counter, the vault escorts coming and going, the clerks scratching entries into ledgers, the sorting carts moving along their tracks. He did not appear distressed. He appeared to be accumulating information at his customary methodical rate, and to have decided that the absence of the sad one was a temporary state that could be managed by watching other things. While Remus was absent, Lucius Malfoy was working. He had contacts in the Ministry's Hall of Records, the office responsible for holding legal documents, including wills. He made inquiries through intermediaries, because the first rule of managing a ministry proceeding was that one's own fingerprints should not appear on the mechanism. He was told the Potter will existed. He asked whether it had been formally registered. He was told it had not. In the chaos following the Potters' deaths in October 1981, Sirius Black arrested the following day without trial. The will had never been entered into the ministry registry. An unregistered will had uncertain legal standing. Lucius thanked his intermediary and ended the conversation. He sat in his study at Malfoy Manor and looked out at the grounds, which were impeccable and still in the grey late-autumn light, and he thought about uncertain legal standing and what a patient man with the right barrister and the right contacts in the Ministry's Hall of Records could make of it over the next several weeks. Quite a lot was his assessment, quite a great deal. 3 days later, the Ministry's representative sent a new communication to Gringotts. It was carefully worded and entirely clear in its implication. The Ministry was disputing the will's legal standing, pending formal registration review. The procedure for assessing an unregistered will's validity was thorough and would take some time. In the interim, the named guardian's legal status could not be treated as operative. Griphook read the communication twice. He thought about Lucius Malfoy's fingers, which were not on this document, but whose pressure he could feel through it as distinctly as a maker's mark through metal. He filed it in the incoming correspondence ledger and returned to the morning's other work. On the second night of the moon, Severus Snape arrived at the bronze doors. He was 23 years old, with black hair that fell in lank curtains on either side of a pale, sallow face, hooked nose, dark eyes that moved across whatever was in front of him with swift, analytical attention and showed nothing of what they found. He wore black robes and carried himself with the flat certainty of someone who expects doors to open when he names himself, because they usually do. He gave his name to the doorman goblin and said he wished to speak with Remus Lupin. He was told Remus Lupin was not present. He produced a sealed letter, plain black wax, no crest, and asked that it be delivered when Lupin returned. The doorman took it. He moved to close the door. The silver inner doors were open by a quarter, briefly, as another goblin passed through from the marble hall. The hall's lantern light fell through the gap, gold and steady, and in it, across the wide marble floor, the small dark-haired boy was visible on the far counter, turned away and apparently asleep on Griphook's folded coat, one small fist tucked under his chin. Snape was still. For 4 or 5 seconds, he looked at the boy across the marble hall, and his face did something that had no name and that he immediately reassembled. Then he turned and went down the white marble steps without another word. Griphook, who had been at the counter, observed this from the corner of his attention. He put the sealed letter beside the incoming correspondence and returned to the record-keeping. On the 4th morning, Remus came back. He came through the side entrance the goblins had shown him and crossed into the marble hall, moving with the slow, careful quality of someone who has been somewhere that cost them something and is still deciding whether it shows. He was thinner than he had been 4 days ago, in the particular way the moon always left him. Not dramatically, not visibly ill, but pared back, as though something had been used that would take longer than 4 days to restore. Sleep and several good meals would begin to address it. They always did, and they never fully did. Harry had been watching the door. He climbed down from the counter and walked across the marble hall in his deliberate way, without hurrying, as though the floor were his, and he had decided to cross it on his own terms, and reached Remus and sat down on his foot. Remus looked down at him. Then he crouched and picked him up, and Harry settled against his shoulder with the placid confidence of someone whose faith in an outcome has been exactly confirmed. Griphook handed Remus the sealed letter. Remus looked at it, the black wax, the handwriting, and his face changed in a way that was not quite surprise, more like the specific resigned recognition of someone encountering a piece of the past they had assumed would stay there. He folded the letter carefully along its existing creases and put it in his pocket. He stood with his hand over the pocket for a moment, in the way of someone checking that something is where they put it. "Snape," he said. It was not clear whether this was an explanation, a realization, or simply the act of saying a name aloud to make it more real. Griphook did not ask what the letter contained. He had learned, in 3 weeks of Remus Lupin, that some things arrived first as names and needed time before they became explanations. He filed the information away in the methodical part of his mind that had been taking notes on James Potter's surviving associates since the morning he found the ring. He would wait. 1 week after the tribunal, the Ministry's Hall of Records located the Potter will. It had been there since October 1981, filed under the Potter's vault number rather than their names. A clerical decision made in the chaos of the days immediately following their deaths, when Sirius Black had been arrested without trial, and the Ministry's record-keeping had operated under conditions less rigorous than its usual standards. The will was unregistered, but it was extant, and it was notarized, and its contents were clear. Harry James Potter's legal guardian, in the event of the deaths of James and Lily Potter, was named as Sirius Orion Black. Sirius Black was in Azkaban. The will could not be executed as written. Gringotts received formal notification of this finding from the Ministry of Magic at mid-morning on a Thursday, and by afternoon, the senior council had convened in the chamber, 40 feet below the marble hall, low-ceilinged, green-lanterned, cold in the way that only rooms very deep in stone can be cold, as if warmth were a surface phenomenon, and this far down there was nothing left of it. Griphook sat along the wall and listened to the positions. They were not by now new. Sirius Black was named guardian, and could not act. The will could not be executed. The Ministry wanted Harry in state protective custody, which the Ministry's communication described as a temporary measure, and which the Senior Council's collective experience of Ministry temporary measures suggested would be temporary in the way that goblin access to wand-making had been temporary, for approximately 3 centuries and counting. Lucius Malfoy's wardship petition was still active, bolstered by a procedural challenge to the unregistered will's legal standing that was progressing through Ministry channels with suspicious efficiency. Albus Dumbledore wanted the child returned to a Muggle address in Surrey for reasons that, while explained at length, had not improved with repetition, and Gringotts had been housing a 3-year-old for 23 days. Then Brock spoke. He was the oldest councillor at the table, which conferred both seniority and a particular kind of directness. He had been in enough rooms, over enough decades, to have stopped performing patients he did not feel. He said, Harry Potter was the heir to Vault 687. His presence in Gringotts had generated more political pressure on the Ministry of Magic than goblins had been able to produce in 3 decades of formal petition. The Brotherhood of Goblins had been seeking Wizengamot representation since the current Ministry framework was established. They had been seeking the right to carry wands, to bear arms, which was the right of every sentient species in Wizarding Europe except goblins, who were trusted to guard the wealth of the wizarding world, but not to carry the means of protecting themselves. They had been seeking formal written acknowledgement from the Ministry that goblin ownership law was valid and binding, that the centuries of seizure and reclassification of goblin-made objects were not simply normal commercial behavior dressed in legal language. The boy was extraordinary leverage. What were they doing, planning to give it away? Griphook waited until the question had settled into the room. Then he spoke. He said his argument was not a moral one. He had no interest in making a moral argument in a room full of experienced bankers who had watched moral arguments about goblin rights fail for the better part of a millennium. His argument was strategic. Every goblin rebellion had ended badly. Not because the goblins were wrong. They were not wrong. They had never been wrong. The question of goblin property rights was as clear as the maker's marks in Vault 687's ring, and had been clear since the first wizard decided that purchasing a goblin-made object meant owning it in perpetuity. The goblins had been right for 1,000 years. They had also lost every open confrontation in that same period. He said, the moment Gringotts refused to surrender Harry Potter in defiance of a direct ministry order, and that order would come in days or weeks if they maintained this position. The ministry would call it a kidnapping. It would not matter whether it was a kidnapping in fact. It would be called one, and it would be believed, because the wizarding public had 2 years of investment in the boy who survived the Dark Lord's curse, and the sight of goblins refusing to release him would fit a story that wizarding Britain already knew how to tell about goblins. They would unite. The ministry would invoke emergency precedent. There was always emergency precedent when the ministry wished to move quickly, and they would come through the bronze doors with hit wizards and auras. Every agreement protecting goblin independence would burn in the justification. The ring was a legitimate claim. The ring they could win. The child they could not keep. He let the chamber be quiet for a moment. Then he set out his alternative. Return Harry Potter to a wizarding guardian, specifically to Remus Lupin under Albus Dumbledore's formal legal guardianship, routing around Lupin's status by placing the legal mechanism in Dumbledore's name, while the practical care remained with Lupin. This arrangement addressed Dumbledore's interest and removed the child from Gringotts without surrendering him to the ministry or to the Malfoy petition. In exchange, and this was the key piece, the ministry would issue a written acknowledgement of the goblin ownership claim on the ring, a formal, documented, ministry-signed statement that the ring in Gringotts' possession was goblin-made and was held by Gringotts under legitimate goblin property law, and that the ministry recognized the validity of that claim, not a rebate of property rights stretching back centuries, not Wizengamot representation, not wand rights. One ring, one written acknowledgement, the most modest possible claim, and it would be the first time in the modern era that the Ministry of Magic had put its signature to a document acknowledging that goblin ownership law was real. That acknowledgement was the political win, not the boy. The ring and what the ring's acknowledgement meant as a precedent for every object in every goblin vault that had been reclassified as wizarding property when its original owner died. The chamber was quiet. Bruck said, "And you believe Dumbledore and Lupin will agree to this?" Griphook said he believed they could be made to understand that it was the best available resolution. Yes. The council deliberated. They gave him 3 days. Not to negotiate the settlement. 3 days was not enough for that. 3 days to demonstrate that Dumbledore and Remus Lupin would agree to his proposed framework in principle, and that the ministry would accept the written acknowledgement in exchange for ending the standoff. 3 days to show that the mechanism could work before the council committed to it formally. Griphook went to the small room afterward. Harry was awake. He had constructed something on the floor using Griphook's spare cloak, folded into a low, irregular shape, and 3 pieces of bread set along its edges. The bread had been placed with some deliberation in a roughly triangular arrangement around the cloak, though its purpose was not immediately obvious. Harry was crouched behind the cloak's nearest fold with the focused expression of someone conducting operations, making a low sound under his breath. Griphook sat down on the floor beside the construction and looked at it. A fort, by the arrangement. The bread appeared to be some form of fortification, though its military function was perhaps symbolic rather than structural. He sat there for a while and watched Harry defend the fort from whatever Harry was defending it from. Then he said, "You are going to go somewhere new soon." with the sad one. Harry came out from behind the cloak and looked at him. He had the ring box in his hands, though the box was closed. "The sad one," he repeated. Not a question. He was processing it. "His name is Remus," Griphook said. Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ring box. He said, "Remus." It was the first time Griphook had heard him use the name. Remus had told him the name over the past 3 weeks, had used it in conversation near Harry, the way people use names when they want a child to absorb them. And Harry had absorbed it, as he absorbed everything, at his own pace and on his own terms, and had now produced it cleanly and without effort, the way he produced most things once he had decided they were real. Griphook noted it. He would need to begin the negotiations in the morning. Griphook had not told Remus who he was inviting. He had said, with the economy that Remus had come to understand, was not curtness, but precision. "There is someone with information relevant to the tribunal. He will arrive this afternoon. You will meet him in the side room." Remus had agreed, because he had spent the past 3 days helping Griphook navigate 2 negotiations simultaneously, and had developed a working trust in the goblin's judgment about what was useful, and he had gone to the side room and found Severus Snape already there. He had not sat down immediately. He had stood in the doorway for a moment that was a second too long to be incidental, and then he had crossed to the other side of the table and sat. Snape was 23 years old and looked 10 years older. He had looked it since October 1981, which was when Lily had died, and Remus had had 2 years to notice that grief landed differently on different people. On some it hollowed. On Snape it seemed to have calcified, filling in the spaces where ordinary human softness might have lived with something harder and more permanent. He sat across the table with his hands flat on its surface and looked at Remus with the dark, analytical expression of someone who has assessed the room and found it approximately as unpleasant as anticipated. They shared almost nothing. They shared James Potter, which was not the same thing as sharing something. Snape had been tormented by James for 7 years of school, tormented by him and Sirius both, and had never been given anything in those 7 years that looked like an apology. And Remus had loved James, had genuinely loved him, and had stood by and watched, because the years in which standing by seemed like the only option available to a werewolf trying not to be expelled had turned, by slow degrees, into a habit of standing by that he had never been able to stop, and he could not say, in honest memory, at which point those 2 things had become indistinguishable. They did not speak of James. They spoke of Harry. Snape explained the enchantment with the clipped precision of a man who has been explaining something precise to people of varying ability for some time and has learned to choose his words for technical accuracy over accessibility. He said, "Lily's sacrifice created the ancient magic. Dumbledore's intention was to anchor it to Petunia Dursley's blood. Petunia was Lily's sister, the last living blood relative of sufficient proximity. By placing Harry in Petunia's home and allowing the child to grow up there, the enchantment required Harry to live there, not to be deposited there, not to be placed there, as one places an object in a location. To live there. To form, through continuous residence over months and years, a bond sufficient for the magic to recognize the place as home in the specific way the enchantment demanded." He paused. Then he said, "Something removed Harry from Privet Drive before that bond formed." Remus said, "What removed him?" Snape's expression did not change. He said he did not know. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who has examined a question extensively and arrived at the absence of an answer rather than at any of the answers they were searching for, and who has decided that announcing this absence is more useful than pretending to a certainty they do not have. The protection had not activated. It was not dormant. It was not weakened by Harry's departure or waiting to reassert itself when Harry returned. It didn't exist. Something had intervened between Dumbledore's placement of the child and the formation of the bond the enchantment required, and whatever that something was, it was not in any record Snape had been able to access. The question of what it was sat in the room between them, present and unanswered. The door opened. Harry had learned, over a month in Gringotts, that most doors responded to a firm push applied at the right height. He came in the way he did most things, without particular urgency, with complete intention, and without knocking. He crossed the room and approached the table and considered his options, and then he began to climb the chair, a process that involved gripping its back and getting one knee onto the seat and then the other, and which he accomplished with the methodical persistence of someone who has done this before and knows it works if you commit to it. He got onto the chair. He sat. He looked at Remus. Then he looked at the tall, black-robed person on the other side of the table, with the same careful, unhurried attention he directed at anything new. Taking account. Assessing. On the other side of the table, Severus Snape looked at Harry Potter. He had known, in the technical way of knowing things that have been thoroughly explained to you, what he would see. He had been told about the hair, the scar, the eyes. He had prepared himself for it with the thoroughness he brought to difficult analytical tasks, because preparation was the only mechanism he had ever reliably found that worked against things that hurt. He had been preparing for 3 weeks, since the evening he had stood at the bronze doors and glimpsed, through a briefly open door, a small dark shape asleep on a counter. He had not been prepared. The hair was James's, black, untidy, impervious to management, pointing in multiple directions with the cheerful unconcern of something that had decided its natural state was final. The face below the scar was James's forehead, James's nose, James's general construction. All of it was James, precisely and without ambiguity. And the eyes, which were open and directed at him with patient, unintimidated attention, were Lily's. The exact shade, the exact quality of light in them, and the way they moved, and the particular quality of attention they carried, that specific quality that Lily had always had, of seeing what was actually there, rather than what she was supposed to see, and making you aware she was doing it. Both of those things were also in her son's face, looking at him from across the table. He looked down at his hands. Remus was watching him. Remus was very carefully not saying anything, which was perhaps the most useful thing he had done in the past 20 minutes. Harry, having assessed the situation, reached across the table and picked up a piece of bread that had apparently accompanied him into the room unnoticed, and began eating it with complete concentration. Snape looked at the table for another moment. Then he said to Remus that he would testify at the tribunal. He would explain, in the technical terms that made testimony useful to a legal proceeding, why the blood protection could not be reactivated at Privet Drive. The bond between Harry and the Dursley house had never formed, and returning Harry there and hoping the bond might form now was not the certainty it had once appeared to be. There was no magical basis, he would state for the record, for the arrangement Dumbledore had proposed being safer for the child than the arrangement the goblins were proposing. Remus said, "You're doing this because Dumbledore asked you to." Snape said, "Yes." The word had a quality to it, some weight he did not explain and did not need to explain, because it carried its full meaning without decoration. He rose. He took his cloak from the back of the chair. He crossed the room to the door without looking at Harry, who watched him go with the same level attention he had given him when he arrived. At the door, Snape stopped. He did not turn around. He stood at the door for a moment with his hand on the frame, and Remus waited, and Harry chewed his bread. "He has her eyes exactly," Snape said. Then he went through the door and it closed behind him, and the room was quiet, and Harry looked at Remus, and Remus looked at the door, and neither of them said anything for a while. 6 weeks after the doorman found the child on the steps, the entrance hall of Gringotts Wizarding Bank hosted the largest formal gathering it had ever been asked to contain. The bronze outer doors were barred. The silver inner doors were latched from the inside. Between them, the hall held the Goblin Senior Council, behind their long table. The Ministry's representative with his portfolio and 2 aides, Dumbledore in midnight blue, Lucius Malfoy with his barrister, Remus Lupin against the wall, and Snape 2 chairs from Remus, with his hands folded and his eyes fixed on a point slightly in front of him. Griphook stood at the silver doors. The lanterns burned at their steady amber. The stone smelled of old metal and cold. Everyone here had been in this room before. Everyone here had something they hadn't had at the first tribunal. The goblin chair opened proceedings. Lucius Malfoy spoke before Remus could draw breath. He had prepared this. The timing was deliberate. Moving first, obliging the opposing position to respond. He set a document on the table, a formal motion, filed with the Ministry's legal division since the first tribunal, to invalidate Sirius Black's designation as Harry Potter's guardian. A wizard convicted of the murders of 12 muggles, and 1 wizard could not, under any credible legal standard, be appointed guardian of a child. He was pleasant about it. He was always pleasant. Remus stood. The statement was in 3 parts. The first, the ring in Gringotts' possession, was goblin-made. No wizarding party at this table would contest the goblin claim. The claim would be reviewed by the International Confederation of Wizards through established interspecies legal channels. The second, Harry Potter would be placed under the legal guardianship of Albus Dumbledore, who was qualified and willing. Under that guardianship, Harry's day-to-day care would be provided by Remus Lupin. The arrangement did not invalidate the Potter will, which named Sirius Black and remained on record, but could not be superseded by a will whose named guardian was unable to act. The third, the Ministry of Magic would issue a written acknowledgement, signed, witnessed, entered into official record, that goblin-made objects were subject to goblin ownership law upon the death of their wizard purchasers, and that the Ministry recognized the validity of that principle. He sat. The goblin chair invited expert testimony. Snape rose. He had been told he would give testimony, and he gave it without hedging, looking at the table rather than at anyone in the room. The blood-protective enchantment had required Harry to form a genuine residential bond with the Dursley house through continuous habitation. That bond had never formed. The enchantment had not been weakened or suppressed. It had never activated. There was no mechanism by which returning Harry to Privet Drive now would produce a different result with any certainty. The Dursley arrangement offered no magical advantage over a properly supervised wizarding household under a qualified legal guardian. He sat. Lucius raised his hand. His voice was pleasant and regretful, the voice of a man performing regret with the confidence of someone who has practiced it often enough to make it nearly indistinguishable from the original. He said, "A werewolf was not fit to be appointed to the care of a wizarding child." He said this without looking at Remus, as though it were a point of simple principle rather than a targeted objection. He invoked the werewolf register, established by the Ministry in 1947, which monitored known werewolves because the ministry itself had long recognized lycanthropy as a condition requiring oversight. He did not cite a specific statute prohibiting the arrangement, because no such statute had yet been written. He did not need one. The register's existence was an argument. The ministry's own institutional behavior demonstrated its position. Community standards were clear. The proposal was unacceptable. Ramos did not move. His expression was very still, in the way of someone who has made an advanced decision about how to receive a specific kind of blow and is now executing that decision. Dumbledore spoke. His voice was quiet and carried without effort. "Remus Lupin is not Harry's legal guardian," he said. "I am. The proposal names me as the legal guardian and the responsible party. Mr. Lupin is the child's caretaker. There is no law that prohibits a registered werewolf from caring for a child under the legal guardianship of a qualified wizard." He looked at Lucius Malfoy. It was the look of a man who has been playing the same game for a very long time and can see every move remaining. "I am, as it happens, well placed to provide the necessary oversight." Lucius's jaw was still. His eyes moved once. The ministry representative set his portfolio flat on the table. He took a breath that was visible if you were watching for it. The written acknowledgement of goblin ownership law was unprecedented, he said, and would require drafting and formal review, and he anticipated it would generate public discussion in the weeks following its issuance. The ministry was prepared to proceed regardless. The settlement, as presented by Remus Lupin, was accepted. The Malfoy petition was formally denied. The motion to invalidate was noted for the record and set aside. Lucius stood. He adjusted his robes with the precise gesture of a man concluding a transaction rather than conceding one, and walked to the bronze doors, which opened for him, and went out into Diagon Alley without speaking to anyone. The doors closed. The hall was quieter. Harry was brought in from the adjacent room. He came at Griphook's side, at his own pace, and stood in the open floor of the entrance hall, and looked at the assembled adults with the watchful, patient expression that had been his characteristic response to everything Gringotts had put in front of him for 6 weeks. He had James Potter's untidy black hair, Lily Potter's green eyes, a scar on his forehead, and a ring in his right fist. He had found it that morning in the vault-keeper's room, after Griphook told him they would be going to the big room. He had been holding it since. Griphook had allowed this, because this morning required a different kind of management from the previous 42 days. Griphook crouched beside him. He spoke directly, the way he had learned to speak to this child, without condescension, without the elevated register adults used as a substitute for actual communication. "It is time to give it back to me now." Harry looked at him, then at the ring. He was thinking. His face, as always, gave nothing away. "Mine," he said. "Yes," said Griphook, "and it will be kept in the vault." "Where it belongs." "Safe." He paused. "You may come and see it whenever you wish." The hall was very still. The assembled parties, Dumbledore, Remus, the ministry representative, the Goblin Council, Snape against the wall, were watching with the attention of people who have correctly identified that something important is being decided, and who have also correctly identified that they are not the ones deciding it. Harry considered this for a long time. It was an adult's long time, measured against the weight of the thing, rather than against the capacity of a child to wait. And the assembled adults waited with him, because there was nothing else to do. The hall was very still. Someone had stopped breathing deliberately, and was being careful not to resume. Then he opened his fist. He placed the ring in Griphook's palm with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands an act is final, and has made the decision without reservation, and he closed his empty fingers around nothing, and looked at Griphook for a long moment with eyes that were Lily Potter's exactly, green, very bright, carrying their particular quality of seeing what was actually there. And then he turned and reached up toward Remus. Remus picked him up without hesitation. Harry settled against his shoulder with the complete, uncomplicated trust of 6 weeks, the same way he had leaned against Griphook's arm in the marble hall on the day they met, and on every day since, simply without qualification, as though the world were full of solid things, and he had decided to use them. Griphook stood in the entrance hall of Gringotts' Wizarding Bank and held the ring in his closed fist and watched them, and the hall breathed around it all in its old amber lantern light. That was how the Blood War ended. Not in a document, not in a motion formally set aside, not in a pale man adjusting his robes on his way through a door, in a 3-year-old opening his fist on a morning in the 6th week, in the space between the bronze outer doors and the silver inner ones. Griphook closed his hand around the ring. He would put it in the vault. It would be safe there, and the boy would come to see it whenever he wished. 1 year after a goblin found him on the steps, Harry Potter was 4 years old and lived in a house that was not Surrey. The house was small, and the bookshelves were badly organized by system, Remus had explained once, and then had not been able to explain what the system was. The bookshelves covered most of one wall and overflowed onto a second, and Harry had been told he could take down any book he liked as long as he put it back where he found it, which he did, because he was 4 and already understood that some rules had reasons behind them, even when you couldn't see the reason yet. Once a month, Remus disappeared for 3 nights. He left on a Thursday and came back on a Sunday, quiet and careful and slow in his movements, and Harry had worked out, in the patient and methodical way he worked out most things, that the disappearances happened when the moon was full. He had not asked Remus about this directly. He had filed it under the same category as the bookshelves, true, and Remus's, and not yet explained, and therefore not yet his to question. He was 4. He had learned that some things came clear when you waited, and that waiting was easier if you found other things to look at in the meantime. On Tuesdays, Dumbledore visited. He brought sherbet lemons, which he kept in a paper bag in the pocket of whichever robe he was wearing, and produced at some point in the first 10 minutes, with the air of a man for whom this was simply what visiting involved. Harry had learned to accept one and hold it, because the old wizard's face did something particular when Harry took the sweet, something warm and also complicated, which Harry had learned to recognize without yet having the words for it. He watched Dumbledore the way he watched everything, carefully, over time. He had allowed the old wizard into the category of known things during the 4th Tuesday, when Dumbledore had crouched on Remus's sitting-room floor and built a tower out of biscuit tins with complete seriousness, and the tower had fallen over, and Dumbledore had looked at Harry over his half-moon spectacles with an expression that was entirely unguarded. Harry had decided, on that basis, that the old wizard was probably safe. He still watched him. There was something in Dumbledore's eyes when they settled on Harry, a quality Harry could not name at 4. It looked like love. It also looked like something older, something that lived underneath. They were not separate things, but they were not the same thing either. On the mantelpiece in Remus's sitting room there was a photograph. 4 young men on a sunlit lawn, laughing. The photograph moved, the way photographs in this world apparently always moved. Harry had not yet met a wizarding photograph that stayed still, and had come to think of this as simply how photographs worked, and the 4 young men were laughing and turning to look at something just off the frame's edge, their mouths open and their eyes bright and their faces belonging to a specific and private kind of happiness that Harry recognized as the happiness of people who know each other completely. Harry knew their names because Remus had told him. James, Sirius, Peter, Remus. He touched the photograph each morning. He touched the face that was his father's. James, with the untidy hair that was also Harry's hair, with the face that was Harry's face, except for the eyes. And then he touched the others in the order Remus had taught him. He knew his father was gone. He knew his father's name and his father's face, and that his father had laughed like that on sunlit lawns, and he held these things with the particular careful attention of someone who understands that they are all he is going to get and intends to be responsible with them. Sirius he knew less well. He knew Sirius was somewhere that was not here. Not dead, Remus had said, firmly and without detail, and that when Sirius's name came up, Remus's expression changed in the way it changed when the moon approached. Not frightened exactly, but braced, the look of someone tracking a thing they cannot control and have decided to simply be ready for. Peter was gone, too, in a different way. Remus had said Peter was dead with the particular flatness of a sentence that had been said many times, and still had not stopped being strange. On the last Friday of every month, Remus took Harry to Gringotts. They went through Diagon Alley, which Harry liked because of the noise and the smells and the variety of creatures who moved through it as though they owned it, which they appeared to. Through the bronze outer doors and the entrance hall and the silver inner doors. Harry pushed the silver doors himself now, because he had learned the precise height at which to apply the force, and into the marble hall. Griphook met them at the counter. They went down, in the cart, to Vault 687. Harry liked the cart, the way it moved on the rails with clean mechanical purpose, the air rushing past, the deep tunnels blurring. He sat with his knees up and watched the darkness, and felt the specific quality of being inside something very large and very old, and found it reassuring. In the vault there was gold, heaps and mounds of it, more gold than Harry could count, and more than he had found it necessary to try. He always walked past the gold and stopped in front of the small glass case in the far corner, where the ring sat on its square of dark cloth. He looked at it for a while. The ring sat in its case in the lantern's light and looked back, and the vault was quiet around them. "Safe," Harry said. "Safe," said Griphook. Harry was satisfied. They went back up. In the world outside, the Daily Prophet ran occasional stories. The Malfoy guardianship petition had been formally denied in late 1983, and the appeal window had closed without an appeal being filed. Dumbledore's sources, which were not the kind of sources one asked about directly, indicated that Lucius Malfoy was not idle. He was simply patient. He was very good at patient, and patient was a thing that could wait as long as it needed to. In the spring, a letter had arrived for Remus from Narcissa Malfoy, written in a formal hand and signed with her full name, Narcissa Black Malfoy. She asked how Harry was. Remus had held the letter for a long time, then he had not written back. Now it was December, and the marble hall of Gringotts had its usual winter quality, the lanterns burning higher against the dark that pressed through the stone from above, the goblins at their counters in their usual efficient industry, the deep vaults humming below. Harry sat on the counter on Griphook's folded coat, which was where he always sat when they visited, and watched the hall the way he had always watched it, with the patient, accumulative attention that was simply how he looked at things. Griphook set a gold galleon on the counter in front of him. Harry picked it up. He turned it over. He studied the face on it, the profile, the lettering around the edge, with the same seriousness he brought to everything that required examination, which was everything. "What does it say?" he asked. Griphook told him. Harry nodded. He turned the coin once more. He filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept the things he had learned. The goblin word for bronze, which he had now learned 3 times and intended to keep. The names in the photograph. The way the cart felt going down into the vaults. The sound the silver doors made when he pushed them correctly. He added the galleon's inscription to this accumulation and turned it over once more, thoughtful. He was 4 years old. He did not have the words yet for what he knew. But he knew its shape. That many people had wanted something from him the year before, for reasons he was not yet old enough to fully map. He knew the ring in the vault below was his and was safe. He knew his father's face. He knew his father was gone, and that Sirius was somewhere terrible, and that Remus's face when the moon was coming looked like the face of someone carrying something they had never found a way to put down. And he knew, not in words, but in the particular body knowledge of a child who has been picked up and held when he was tired, sat next to when he was patient, spoken to directly and without performance, that one person had sat down on the cold floor beside him while he slept, in a stone room below a marble hall, and had kept watch through the night without being asked. That was what he knew of the world so far. Griphook was watching him, with the dark, clever eyes that had first seen him on a marble step in the pre-dawn dark 1 year ago. Harry looked back at him, the galleon still in his hand. In the house that was not Surrey, the sad one was waiting to take him home.